April 8, 1943. 27,000 feet over northern France. The sky was a flat, iron disk. The sun burned off the high haze and threw black silhouettes sharp against white cloud. A formation of heavy bombers plodded on course beneath, their bellies bright with flak scars. Above them, an American fighter with a broad fuselage and stubby wings rode the thin air, engine rumbling like a distant freight, an engine that did not scream so much as shove. From below, a line of Messerschmitts sliced up like knives, confident, compact, expecting the kind of weaving, graceful fighting an earlier war had rewarded. They expected agility. They found thunder. Before the first encounter that day, the P-47 Thunderbolt had been, to many of its enemies and some of its allies, an oddity. Heavy, blunt, a flying truck to be sidestepped or laughed at. The pilots who flew it carried that awkwardness into combat and learned, sometimes brutally, how that truck could be made to bite. On that April morning, the air taught the lesson in stern syllables. The R-2800 radial at full song, the turbo spooling, the guns firing in a breath that could unmake a wing. What the Germans had mocked became, in time, a new grammar of air war. But that transformation did not arrive all at once. It was the product of design compromises, doctrinal stubbornness, tactical improvisation, and the sheer arithmetic of factories running day and night. If this story asks a single question, it is this: how does a machine that looks clumsy become a harbinger of dominance? The answer lives in steel and fire, in the soft, emphatic voices of mechanics at midnight, in pilots' shouted reports, in the rattle of ammunition being loaded into belts, and in 1,000 small decisions that together made the Thunderbolt more than the sum of its parts. Stay with it until the end. If this account gives you a clearer sense of how modern air power is fashioned, consider subscribing and leaving a like. There are more stories like this to unfold. The Thunderbolt's origin began on drawing boards years before the combat that would define it. Alexander Kartveli, an immigrant engineer with a bent for large, powerful fighters, envisioned an aircraft that would not be elegant but would be robust. The Republic aviation design that emerged around the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp engine was massive. A broad fuselage to house a large turbocharger plumbing, a thick wing to carry fuel and guns, a beefy landing gear to sustain weight and shock. The turbocharger, a technical phrase that in practice meant the Thunderbolt could make power where thinner-engined fighters could not, translated into the simple, brutal advantage of performance at altitude. A P-47 could dive and regain speed without the engine choking at 27,000 feet. It could zoom up again with energy the Germans could not always match. Technical eyes traced that advantage in numbers. 8 50 caliber machine guns, distributed across the wings, poured out an avalanche of lead. Large internal fuel tanks and the ability to carry drop tanks extended range. The airframe's bulk brought with it a capacity to absorb damage the lighter fighters could not. But these were features on a drawing. They needed pilots who would learn not to trade position for maneuver, mechanics who could keep the turbo and R-2800 running through long missions, and factories that could produce fuselages by the dozen. The early operational experience was uneven. Training units in England learned the Thunderbolt's temper the hard way. Heavy controls at low speed, ground handling quirks, a tendency to snap in certain configurations. A young pilot would taxi a Thunderbolt and feel the mass of it, hands and shoulders working the stick like steering a reluctant beast. Accidents came in those first months. Wheels collapsed on rough fields, engines were starved by clogged intakes, inexperienced pilots stalled on takeoff. Ground crews learned to treat each airplane as a patient. Meticulous oil checks, attention to turbo plumbing, gentle coaxing of a reluctant supercharger. Mechanics stayed late, hands dark with grease, hearts steady with the knowledge that an aircraft patched at midnight would be a life preserved at dawn. Combat forced faster lessons. The American doctrine that had been comfortable for nimble fighters, trading turns, dogfighting in the visual arena, did not play to the Thunderbolt's strengths. What emerged from hard experience was a tactic that exploited the P-47's fundamental traits. Boom and zoom. Climb above, dive with mass and speed, strike with concentrated fire, then climb out again. The turbocharger allowed the P-47 to maintain manifold pressure where others could not. That translated into speed in a dive that made the Thunderbolt a predator from altitude. Convergence settings for the wing guns were tightened for destructive short bursts. Brief, savage salvos could shear control surfaces or set an engine ablaze. Where the nimble Messerschmitt might win in close, sustained turning fights, it could not always withstand a single, perfectly delivered rip from 2,000 feet above. There are pivot points in war where a single encounter changes doctrine. On June 26, 1943, 2nd Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson of the 56th Fighter Group experienced such an encounter. Johnson, a young pilot from Pennsylvania, quick-spoken, quick to grin, was in a dogfight over the French coast when his P-47 was hit badly. Accounts later filed in terse combat reports speak of a fuselage shredded, control cables cut, a shower of oil and metal. Pilots watching from nearby saw the Thunderbolt rolling, slipping, then toward a crash that seemed unavoidable. It did not crash. Johnson wrestled with a dying machine, felt the rudder twitch as cables snapped, the radio die and come alive with fear. He brought the airframe home, a demonstration of survivability that would be cited again and again. Returned despite severe damage, the report would state with the clinical distance of official papers. That single survival, more than the airframe's raw numbers, began to shape an idea among squadron commanders. This airplane, if handled right, could sustain punishment and still return its man to the fight. Word moved fast among pilots. Lt. Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, an ace whose steady eye and blunt appraisal carried influence, began writing up recommendations about employment. Use height, not position, he urged. Gabreski's notes, passed through briefing rooms and airfield mess halls, counseled turning weaknesses into strengths. Let the P-47 be the heavy hammer from above. Other names attached themselves to emerging doctrine. Major Donald Bliley, a squadron commander who favored clear radio calls and disciplined diving runs. Captain Walker Mahurin, who tested limits of speed and control. Major David Schilling, who by example showed aggression balanced with conservative energy management. These men were not doctrinal theorists so much as practitioners. They flew, they crashed, they learned and taught. Combat vignettes illustrate the interplay of design and practice in a way a ledger cannot. On an August day in 1943, during the Regensburg-Schwäbisch raids, bomber streams made themselves obvious targets and the Luftwaffe came up in force. Pairs and flights of Thunderbolts circled, protecting bombers at altitude. A German formation attacked, a combination of Bf-109s and Fw-190s, expecting the usual close melee. What followed was a succession of short, violent blows. Thunderbolts would dive with lethal intent, guns ripping at a wing root, voice-thick reports later registering single bursts that sent enemy aircraft into spirals of smoke. One after another, the attackers, taken by concentrated wing fire and unable to close without suffering catastrophic hits, peeled off. Observers in the escort group remembered the sky filling with black puffs and thin threads of smoke. "We watched them break like brittle things," a captain would later report. The image of the Thunderbolt as a blunt instrument suddenly rearranged into that of a locomotive bearing down with intention, heavy, unstoppable if met head-on. The shift in German perception was not instantaneous. Early on, some Luftwaffe pilots called the Thunderbolt a clumsy thing, a dinosaur in their slang. But by late 1943 and into 1944, the language changed. A captured report after a hard day of fighting mentioned the American fighters' ability to sustain damage and continue. and a Luftwaffe intelligence summary used a word that captured the new mood: respect. When a formation of Thunderbolts came in with half their tails shot away and pilots climbed out alive, the anecdotes spread in German mess halls like rumor, then fact. The arc from derision to dread is one of perception meeting persistent evidence. Once enough pilots from both sides had seen the same result on repeated occasions, doctrine followed. While tactics evolved in the sky, the war below hinged on arithmetic. Republic's factories, from Farmingdale to Evansville, ran with production schedules that read like industrial poetry. Fuselages, wings, engine cowlings dropped in steady rhythm, women and men on assembly lines moving from bolt to panel with practiced hands. The Lake City ammunition plant and similar facilities kept belts full. Logistics meant that a damaged Thunderbolt could be shopped, repaired, and back in action with a cadence that German depots, under the strain of Allied bombing and resource shortages, struggled to match. The Americans could lose planes and still return a near-constant flow. That flow made attrition a weapon. It allowed commanders to trade planes for tactical gain in a way the Luftwaffe, shrinking in material and manpower, increasingly could not. There were human costs embedded in those numbers. Replacement pilots arrived with a curriculum of hours that could never replicate the feeling of bullets knocking lightly at fabric or the sound of a wing stalling. Some never adapted. Training regiments expanded, flight hours increased, but the time it takes to learn judgment under fire is not a variable easily engineered. A young pilot might learn to throttle and bank, to navigate and aim, but the split-second choice to maintain energy or to trade altitude for position came with experience that only combat could teach. Commanders recognized this and adjusted. Strict formations, clearer radio discipline, pairing less experienced men with veterans. The P-47 itself was, in many squadrons, a teacher. By its temperament, it forced certain choices that accelerated practical learning. D-Day, June 6, 1944, opened a new chapter in how the Thunderbolt was employed. With vast numbers of aircraft taking to the air to suppress coastal defenses and interdicted supply lines, the P-47's role shifted decisively into ground attack. Its weight, once criticized, became an asset against concrete and armored targets when loaded with bombs and rockets. The machine that had been designed with altitude performance in mind found itself low and hard over the Normandy hedgerows, ripping at anti-tank guns and rail junctions. Pilots learned new rhythms: pull low, deliver ordnance in a brief blistering run, climb with what energy remained, and return. The result was brutal efficiency. Armored columns stalled beneath repeated attacks. Supply lines frayed. The P-47's 8 heavy machine guns chewed through soft targets and anti-aircraft positions. The shape of ground operations shifted under this aerial pressure. Operation Bodenplatte on January 1, 1945, was a desperate Luftwaffe gambit to punch Allied air power at its heart: massed attacks on forward airfields in the Low Countries. Surprise was the aim. At first it worked. Airfields burned, aircraft on the ground were damaged or destroyed in torrents of fire. Yet the American system proved resilient. Depots that could strip and replace aircraft, the sheer volume of available spare parts, and the speed of recovery meant that the temporary shock of Bodenplatte never translated into strategic rollback. Within days, runways were cleared, replacement aircraft taxiing under their own power where planes had stood in smoking ruins. The effort displayed a grim arithmetic. Industrial redundancy defeats localized cunning. Luftwaffe's daring had tactical effect, but strategic insufficiency. There were other theaters where the Thunderbolt adapted. The P-47N variant, with extended range and fuel capacity, flew across the Pacific, escorting long-range bombers and performing strike missions on island targets. Here, the same design philosophy, an emphasis on power and endurance, found new expression. In dogged, sea-swept airstrips, mechanics spoke the same language of late hours and steady hands. The Thunderbolt, whether over Europe or the Pacific, was a testament to a design that could be repurposed when need demanded. Tactical anecdotes dot the ledger like nails in barnwood, each holding a small truth. Captain John C. Mears, in one account, dove his Thunderbolt through shrapnel and found the aircraft responded with a kind of unwilling grace. A wing panel would crumple but not fail, the pilot coaxing the machine back to base like a stubborn animal. Colonel Neil Kirby, on another sortie, counted the bursts and noted the way concentrated fire disintegrated an FW-190's tail in a heartbeat. These stories are not melodrama. They are precise accounts of what happens when power, placement, and concentration meet fragile airframes built for different trade-offs. Production figures and logistics matter because wars are resolved in factories as much as in cockpits. Republic's output surged. Whole lines of Thunderbolts rolled off jigs and into testing. Engines were mated and tested, and logistical networks moved replacement parts across oceans. Ammunition plants fed guns with belts and belts of 50 caliber rounds. Depots organized repair chains that could swap empennages overnight. These were not abstract efficiencies, they were decisive. A pilot who returned with a shot-up fuselage could, within a tight corridor of time, be given another ship and sent back. The Luftwaffe could not replicate that tempo by late 1944. Their skilled pilots, once numerous, were diminishing, and training could not keep pace with losses. Psychology followed mechanics. German pilots who had once laughed at the Thunderbolt now spoke of it with the tone reserved for predators. Wary, respectful, sometimes resigned. The anecdote that gives this piece its title, a P-51 Mustang that landed by itself with the pilot's door locked from the inside, lives in this landscape of uneasy transformations. It circulated first as sailors' gossip, then in mess halls, then in the mild astonishment of veterans' reunions. The story is simple. A Mustang, a fighter prized for its grace and speed, taxied to a landing strip after a mission and, upon inspection, revealed that the cockpit door had been locked from within. No pilot was inside, no parachute on the ground. The immediate implication is odd and unsettling, floating suggestions of hypoxia, of pilots passing out of altitude, of the coldness of thin air taking command of a man's consciousness. Mechanically, it is an object lesson. If controls are left set, an aircraft's systems may guide a doomed but autonomous glide to terra firma. Psychologically, the tale is richer. It marks how even the most graceful machines can be treacherous when the human component fails, and it stands as a counterpoint to the Thunderbolt story, a reminder that engineering cannot absolve human fragility. Veterans who tell the Mustang tale often append it to Thunderbolt stories as a sort of rueful metaphor. Technology carries power, but not inevitability. The Thunderbolt's survivability was a function of systems plus human skill plus industrial backup. A pilot's locked cockpit door is an image that underscores the finality of human failure when not balanced by redundancy. The Mustang anecdote does not act as evidence against the Thunderbolt's successes. Rather, it humanizes the broader narrative. Machines are tools, and their outcomes rest on brittle human life. Those who survived the war returned to a world that would memorialize both machine and man. Reunions in the 1950s and 1960s saw men whose hands still bent as if gripping a stick gather in halls with faded unit patches pinned to suits. Conversation often drifted to improbable returns. Johnson's survival, Gabreski's reports, Bliley's tactical memos. Mechanics who had worked at Evansville spoke quietly about nights when entire wings were bolted on by lamplight. Factory women who had riveted empennages told of a rhythm so ingrained they dreamed in rivet patterns. Museums later preserved a Thunderbolt with panels polished, hardware conserved, and placards explaining the R-2800's role. Visitors, children and veterans alike, traced the outline of the airframe with fingers, moved close to see the scars of wartime repairs, and felt, perhaps for the first time, the heavy truth of that machine's presence. The final calculations of war are statistical, but their human resonance endures. The Thunderbolt's contributions are not captured by a single number, but by a pattern: sustained production, doctrinal adaptability, tactical effectiveness, and the stubbornness of an airframe that returned its men again and again. Luftwaffe collapse was not a single event, but an outcome of cumulative pressure. air superiority eroded by consistent attrition, logistical insufficiency, pilot drain, and strategic overreach. By the time spring warmed the fields of 1945, the vast arithmetic of American industry had turned attrition into inevitability. Yet history does not permit triumphalism without tragedy. For each aircraft that returned, for each successful raid, there were losses that left families bereaved and airfields with empty bunks. The calculus that turned aircraft into strategic levers was also one that consumed lives. Veterans' voices, when they speak of victory, speak also of comrades who did not come home, of pilots who pushed too far, of mechanics who kept working through fatigue to keep the next sortie alive. Reconciling admiration for engineering with respect for human cost is the proper posture toward this story. The museum epilogue is a small, telling scene. A restored P-47 sits under soft lights. Its panels gleam with an order that time had once denied. A veteran, older now and slower, runs a hand along a rivet line. He recounts to young listeners how an engine once coughed and then roared again after a midnight wrenching to keep the turbo clear. Nearby, a display recounts odds and figures. Sorties flown, enemy aircraft claimed, supply lines interdicted. On a small placard, someone has stapled a photocopy of a note that mentions, almost as a throwaway anecdote, a P-51 that landed by itself and the pilot's door was locked from the inside. The children laugh at the oddity. The veteran falls quiet. He looks at the Thunderbolt and then back at the placard and says, not in boast, but in a tone of weary gratitude, "We built a thing that could take a man home." There are technical asides that deserve clarity. The R-2800's turbocharged setup meant sea-level power at altitude. In practical terms, that allowed sustained climbs after high-speed attacks. Convergence settings, the angle at which wing guns aimed toward a single point ahead, were tuned to produce a tight, fatal cone of fire at 250-300 yards, maximizing destructive effect on a single pass. Ammunition loadouts were balanced. Enough rounds to guarantee a kill in a brief burst, but not so many as to unduly burden climb performance. These are not arcane choices. They are tactical levers that, when adjusted, changed outcomes in the sky. As the war ebbed and then closed, the Thunderbolt's narrative settled into a larger history of innovation meeting opportunity. It was not, in any meaningful sense, inevitable that a heavy fighter would dominate the sky. Rather, it was the confluence of factors: design that accepted weight as a virtue, skilled pilots who adapted to energy tactics, factories that delivered quantity without compromising essential quality, and logistics that turned damage into short delay, that created an instrument of strategic consequence. In the end, what endures is a double memory: of a machine whose bulk and thunder reshaped air combat, and of the human beings who designed, maintained, flew, and were sometimes consumed by it. The anecdote of the Mustang landing by itself, its pilot's door locked within, remains a ghostly coda, a reminder of the frailty that underlies all mechanical competence. The Thunderbolt story is not comfortable. It is powerful, sobering, and instructive. Where steel and thunder met human choice, the map of the sky changed. If this account left you with questions, memories, or a respect for the messy craft of wartime aviation, leave a comment and tell us which moment struck you most. Subscribe to follow more histories that trace how machines and men together shaped the 20th century's decisive battles. He walks away from the display with a slow, measured gait, carrying the quiet weight of years. Behind him, the Thunderbolt seems larger than when he first touched it, not only by metal and engine, but by story. The children mill about, still arguing whether that locked door tale was true or simply a joke the guide tells to keep them interested. A young woman lingers at the placard, tracing the numbers with a fingertip, as if trying to make arithmetic reconcile with memory. Outside, the museum's glass doors throw the April light across the tarmac, where, in another life, concrete would have been filthied by oil and the stomp of boots. Time has polished much, but the traces of exigency remain in small things. The scuff where a ladder once scraped an aileron, the faint halo of soot beneath an exhaust stack,
a patch of fresh rivets that speak of a local workshop's devotion. To understand why the Thunderbolt so often becomes an anchor for memory, one must follow not only the broad strokes of doctrine and production, but the narrower, everyday choices that shaped lives. Consider a single pilot's sortie in late 1944. He files into a formation over the English Channel, the cold press of altitude in his lungs. His mission is interdiction on a rail hub used to move reinforcements toward the front. On paper, it is a strike, essential routine. In the air, it is something else, a calculus of speed and exposure, of where to aim the first pass for the highest chance of disabling a locomotive, and where to accept the risk of flak that will surely splash the field. He draws energy from his turbocharger, trades altitude for speed, stabilizes the aiming reticle for the convergence point his flight leader has set, squeezes, and the P-47 answers. Bombs fall where brief explosive orange stains the ground. Rockets seek out rails and rolling stock. A salvo of 20 millimeters would have meant a different kind of theater. Here, the Thunderbolt's ordnance and its pilot's nerve are in harmony. Afterwards, there might be damage, a holed radiator, a scorched fabric on a control surface. But the airframe, fortified and forgiving, gives the pilot a chance to bring the machine back to soil. That forgiving nature was not merely engineering bravado. It was policy manifested in steel.
Designers accepted mass and armor because commanders in the field demanded that their pilots survive long enough to fight again. Pilots learned to exploit that weight, dive to regain speed, trade altitude for maneuvering room, use the Thunderbolt's momentum as a weapon. This doctrinal coevolution, plane and tactic refining each other, explains how the P-47 shifted from an aircraft some argued was too ponderous to a tool of both air superiority and battlefield shaping. The shift in role is visible in operational histories. In the spring after the Normandy landings, as hedgerow fighting ground on, the need for close support became paramount. Fighter groups equipped with Thunderbolts turned from high-level escort profiles into low-level strafing and bombing missions over the Bocage. The same airframe that could reach up and meet high-altitude formations could also, when called, dive and burn across a hedgerow to suppress an anti-tank position. This flexibility placed crews in new moral and physical circumstances. Attacks would sometimes be mere yards from friendly units. Pilots would see the face of war in a way that bomber crews rarely did. Those who flew close support returned with stories of near misses, of civilians warned away by white phosphorus's ugly light, of tank columns stopped by a well-placed fragmentation pattern. The Thunderbolt's payload options, bombs, rockets, napalm in some theaters, made it one of the most feared and, to ground troops, the most cherished aircraft over Europe. Yet these battlefield accomplishments cannot be decoupled from the cost. Tactical success demanded repeated exposure. Not every sortie returned clean. Ground fire, the most democratic of threats, rewarded persistence with injury. Parachutes saved some. The aircraft itself saved others. The radial engine's ability to survive hits, the sturdiness of the landing gear, the redundancy built into control runs, all of these attributes translated into lives preserved. When crews reminisce, they often balance technical admiration with a sober ledger of those who did not come back. That mental arithmetic, triumph measured beside loss, is essential to how veterans remember. Post-war, the Thunderbolt's material life continued in unexpected ways. Many airframes were scrapped, others were sold abroad or repurposed for peacetime tasks. The United States Army Air Forces reclassified the design as the F-47 during the transition to the independent U.S. Air Force era. Nations rebuilding their air arms acquired Thunderbolts for patrol, transport escort, and training. The jet age arrived quickly, and the piston fighter receded. Yet traces remained. Airframes used as target tugs, as aerial fishery spotters, as monuments on plinths at airfields. A handful survived in private hands, guarded by collectors who read maintenance manuals like scripture and who regarded each found bolt as a relic. Restoration itself became a small, intensely technical liturgy. An original R-2800 is not a commodity that turns up on a whim. It must be hunted, examined, rebuilt. Restorers learn the idiosyncrasies of the Pratt & Whitney twin-row radial, the tendencies toward oil seepage under certain temperature cycles, the need for precise valve timing in engines that once burned high-grade avgas. Corrosion attacks hidden seams and stress points where wartime repairs had been made in haste. Finding acceptable substitutes for obsolete alloys requires careful engineering judgment and, sometimes, the blessing of regulatory authorities who allow sympathetic modernization without hollowing out authenticity. The avionics on flying restorations are often discreetly modernized for safety: transponders, radios, emergency locators. These compromises sit uneasily next to purists' desires, but are necessary when a 90-year-old airframe returns to an airshow circuit where airspace and liability require certain precautions. In hangars where restorations take place, conversations between mechanics and historians reveal what those who loved the machine still value. A veteran's anecdote about a midnight patch job becomes a lesson plan for a volunteer who will spend weeks reshaping a fairing. A clerk's wartime logbook, yellowed, margins filled with terse ink, can unlock a paint scheme's authenticity. The work is painstaking, and it creates communities. Friends meet to rivet a patch, to coax a 30-year dormant carburetor back into life, to argue whether a particular nose art belonged to a specific squadron or if it was an imaginative reproduction. These acts of care are, in themselves, an extension of the wartime ethic: preserve, maintain, and prepare for the next mission, even if that mission is now to educate. Memory inhabits other spaces as well: the tactical manuals, the after-action reports, the letters home. Reading a pilot's log next to a mechanic's ledger exposes a division of labor that is rarely romanticized. Those who flew received public acclaim. Those who kept planes flying received gratitude in quieter forms. When historians reconstruct an engagement, both voices are necessary. The pilot remembers the feel of throttle response and the way the aircraft could be coaxed up a certain envelope. The mechanic remembers recurring faults and the improvisations that became routine. Veterans of the ground crews often speak of fatigues and hunger, of patching ailerons beneath miserable weather, of stealing a brief cigarette on a ring of tar that dried on a hangar floor. Their testimony adds texture to the broader calculus. Strategy is executed by bodies and hands over time. There are ethical lessons braided into these technical and human details. Celebrating innovation must never sanitize the moral complexity of force. Aircraft designed to win battles also devastated infrastructure and, at times, civilian life. Many veterans carry the memory of missions that, in immediate terms, saved comrades' lives, but in longer view, inflicted harm on communities. Reckoning with that double edge is part of how societies remember wars. Museums that curate Thunderbolts are therefore tasked with an uneasy stewardship: to show an artifact's achievements without turning it into a fetishized icon. The best exhibits do not merely display numbers. They frame decisions and invite visitors to imagine the choices, operational, political, individual, that produced those statistics. Back in the hangar, the veteran pauses beneath the Thunderbolt's wing and talks to a docent about a mission over the Ardennes. He does not seek to be the center of attention. Rather, he wants to put a human scale on a tactical diagram. He speaks of radio silence, of the small mercy of a cloud bank that hid a formation long enough for a flak battery to be bypassed, of the strange intimacy that forms between men who fly together day after day. The docent translates military shorthand for the crowd, explaining why those weather-worn seams were often the result of emergency repairs away from base. And the children listen, rapt, until the adult question interrupts: how did you keep from being afraid? He considers the query as if the answer were a technical part he can lift and display. You never stopped being afraid, he says finally. You learned to keep moving anyway. That's not courage like in stories. It's the sort that gets you home because you made a choice to do what had to be done. His voice is small in the broad bay, but the phrase circulates. Fear, acknowledged, does not vanish, but it becomes a companion in the cockpit. Outside, the tarmac shines under the low sun. The Thunderbolt's shadow falls long across painted walkways. In a corner of the field, volunteers set up for a commemorative lecture that will draw a different crowd tonight. Men in uniforms folded with respect, relatives clutching program booklets, students whose coursework requires a visit. They will hear about sortie rates, about the strategic debates that once raged in Allied headquarters, about industry metrics that turned machine into mass. They will also hear hesitations and silences, the names of those who did not return, the awkward admissions about missions whose outcomes were mixed. This is how a machine becomes a mirror. The Thunderbolt reflects not just technological ingenuity, but the layered, sometimes contradictory, nature of wartime memory. It asks listeners to admire and to mourn, to appreciate craft and to recognize cost. For a nation that built thousands of such aircraft, each represents a node in a web of production, policy, and personal sacrifice. When the crowd begins to thin, the veteran signs a few programs and accepts a cup of tea offered by a young volunteer.
They talk briefly about the mechanics of rivet work and the funny ways language evolves in hangars, a technical phrase that once meant one thing now means another in restoration vernacular. He stands to leave and pauses once more under the Thunderbolt's nose, looking up at the spinner and the cowl that once bit into the sky. He does not reach out now. Instead, he folds his hands and walks quietly across the lot, each step marking the slow ferrying of a memory from urgency into care. There are other Thunderbolts in the world, some still flying, others preserved beneath museum lights in distant countries. Each carries its own registry of missions and repairs, its own small accretions of meaning. Together they form a dispersed archive, a way to hold the technical, the tactical, and the human in a single frame. To study them is to learn not only about engines and angles of attack, but about the rhythms of decision that connect the factory floor to the foxhole, the briefing room to the farmhouse that waited up the road. And so the story of the Thunderbolt continues to be told in 1,000 modest ways. In the careful hands of restorers, in the clipped sentences of operation orders, in the essays of historians who comb through microfiche for overlooked details, and in the slow, private monologues veterans deliver at kitchen tables. None of these forms alone is exhaustive. Only together do they begin to approximate the truth of what that heavy, thunderous bird did and what it required. The doors of the museum close against the evening chill. Lights come up inside and silhouettes move past the P-47's gleam. Outside, a child who had earlier laughed at the locked door tale turns back for one last look, as if expecting the plane to answer. The Thunderbolt does not move. It does not have to. It keeps the echo of engine roar within its skin, vibrating memory into the air around it, a resonance that will outlive the men who first put it to work, because machines, like stories, are ways of carrying forward what we refuse to forget. He walks the long way home, not because the distance matters, but because he is learning, after so many years, how to carry the evening in measured steps. The air has cooled, and the smell of tarmac blends with damp grass. The hangar lights behind him throw the Thunderbolt into a hard silhouette that follows like a second self. When he reaches the edge of the field, he stops and turns once, as if taking a photograph with his eyes, imprinting the line of fuselage against the sky. Then he lets the scene fold away and goes on. The house sits at the end of a short lane, low and stubborn beneath a row of maples. Inside, the kettle clicks off with an old, accustomed sound. The veteran moves slowly, an economy of motion, learned to preserve an old joint or to spare the quickening of a heart that remembers climb and dive.
He puts the program from the museum on the kitchen table, beside the cup that somebody, a volunteer, a stranger, a child, had balanced there for him. The tea has cooled and the cup leaves a faint ring. He does not bother to warm it. He is content with that small, cold comfort. He opens a drawer where flight gloves are kept with other things that stay with you because they are made to bear what you could not. Beneath the gloves lie a photograph, a folded note, a small dented compass that still points as if in disbelief. The photograph is of 3 young men under a summer sky, haircut and faces sunburned, grins raw and surprised by their own luck. One of them is him. He traces the outline of a jaw with a fingertip and thinks of how quick time is to erase the edges of a face until memory must supply them, softer and more generous than reality ever was. The folded note is creased soft from being opened and reread. His eyes find the looping, earnest handwriting across the page. It is not addressed to him at all, at least not in the way letters usually are, but to the idea of return. "If I don't get the chance," the writer had said, "remember the things we laughed about, and find Mary when you can. Tell her about the sowing season. Tell her how the radio sang when we flew over the river. The ink is smudged where rain must have kissed the paper." He had carried the note in a pocket for months. Later, when he had no words to write back, he folded it into silence and put it away. He sits with the note and does something he has not done in decades. He answers, aloud and without pretense, the sentence that never had the chance to be finished. He speaks the names into the room, the name of the comrade, the name of that woman who loved him from poor letters. And the act of saying them organizes them into a sequence of meaning rather than leaving them to float as abstract guilt. The words are small. They are not a confession. They are not even contrition. They are a measure of fidelity, the most he can muster, and they fall into the quiet as if into the cup on the table. Outside, in a street lamp pool, a motorbike passes. The sound is a thin thread of current, and for a moment he is back in the cockpit, the rush of air and oil and the promise of engine heat. He remembers the ear splitting, the sudden light when flak took a wingman away. He remembers sliding his hands along the stick and finding that the fingers would obey because the brain had ordered them so. Fear, he thinks again, the companion that would not leave. He learns to speak of it as something faithful rather than shameful. It did not command him, it accompanied him. He takes out his old logbook. The pages are soft at the edges, a ledger of missions and crossings, of times and altitudes, and the small margin notes where a man once scrawled a joke or a name. There is blank space at the back he never used, thinking he might one day write a proper accounting. Tonight, he takes a pen and writes no technical entry, only a short line. Visited Thunderbolt. Heard children ask how to be brave. Remembered to be honest about fear. He underlines it because habit tells him to mark the important. Marking is a way to insist that something happened. When he was young, the need to measure everything had been practical. Fuel loads, wind corrections, radio frequencies. Now the measurements are different. A length of silence between sentences, the time it takes to walk from the kitchen to the porch and back, the way his hand chooses the same mug even when there are others. He pins the child's drawing from the museum program to a corkboard above the kettle. It is a crude thing, an airplane with an enormous smiling pilot, crayons scribbling sun and blue. The pilot's mouth is a bright rectangle, and the propeller is a flower. He smiles at it like one might at a photograph from a shipmate who has aged into a different laugh. The drawing is proof to him that the Thunderbolt story will not die with him. It will be retold in more clumsy, more generous forms. Sleep, when it comes, is lighter than it used to be. He dreams, as veterans do, in the language of engines, a persistent, distant pulse that feeds the center of the night. In the morning he wakes to the sound of a plane overhead, a clean, modern note crossing the sky. For an instant he thinks the Thunderbolt has risen. He stands by the window and watches a small modern craft slip along the blue, precise and unsentimental. He feels no envy. Instead, a hush of recognition, as if all planes, whatever their skin, belong to the same family of noise and intent. The machine has not been baptized by myth. It has been made human by use. The museum calls in the mid-morning. A volunteer wants to know if he might return for a recorded interview, a formal one to be added to the archive. He hesitates. The idea of being labeled, indexed, scheduled makes him uneasy. He says yes because the volunteer's voice is earnest, and because he thinks of the child's questions and how they demand more than the dry list of sorties. He thinks of the logbook and the corkboard and the note in his hand. He will tell them, he decides, the kind of truth that is not a heroic narrative, but a ledger of small decisions, to launch despite fear, to tend to the living rather than the dead, to carry the story forward without polishing it. When he returns to the hangar the second time, the light is different, and the Thunderbolt sits like an old, patient animal. There are more people gathered. A woman in her 60s with a small envelope in her hand, 2 students with cameras who speak in low, careful tones, and the docent who recognizes him and gives him a nod that is part greeting and part invitation. The woman approaches with a steady step. She places the envelope on the plane's wing and opens her hands as if offering a sacrifice that asks nothing back. Inside is a photograph and a name. The man who had written that rain-kissed note so many years ago. The photograph is worn. The handwriting on the back is almost illegible. The woman says simply, "He was my brother." She had come because she had read the names in the program, and a single obscure reference had made a light inside her go on. The veteran listens as she talks, and when she mentions the sowing season and the way her brother used to hum on long nights, the details unspool into 3 people who had never sat at the same table. They stand together under the Thunderbolt, and a restoration man passes a polishing rag along the fuselage, leaving brief, shiny tracks that catch the gathering light. The conversation shifts from mechanics to memory and back again without apology. A student asks about the decisions made at a briefing table. The docent explains with a practical, almost clinical tone that shows how a mind trained to translate risk reduces heroism into probabilities. The veteran contradicts none of it. He offers instead what cannot be computed: the weight of the pause before a throttle is opened, the way a look across a cockpit can carry an entire conversation. Before they leave, the veteran takes the photograph into his hand. His fingers know how to hold a thing reverently without needing to sing its praises. He traces the face in the slight grain of the print and thinks of all the ways a life is recorded. In paper, in rumor, in the fuselage scars of a machine. He promises the woman, who is both stranger and kin, that he will keep the photograph safe. Not because it is his right, but because memory is an economy that only functions when someone invests in a particular coin. Later, when the hangar is clearing and the volunteers are hanging nets and folding chairs, the veteran lingers by the Thunderbolt. A small boy, the same who had looked back the night before, tugs at his sleeve. "Will you tell me a story?" the child asks, eyes wide, as if he holds a precious permission. The veteran hesitates and then nods, not from the desire to perform, but because stories, like engines, need regular motion to remain alive. He tells the child of a day when clouds piled like broken ships, and a run of bad weather made each brief moment of clarity a small mercy. He tells it plainly. He includes fear and hunger and the absurd kindnesses that happen in cramped cockpits. The child listens with the solemnity of the newly converted. They part with a handshake that means more than camaraderie. It is a passing of responsibility. The veteran realizes with a kind of surprise that the archive is no longer only paper and metallic parts. It exists in the tiny, mutable place where a child decides to learn the difference between reverence and idolization, where a woman finds a photograph and learns to place mourning in a public rather than a private registry, where volunteers stitch the seams of a fuselage not only for the sake of aesthetics, but to keep the sound of an engine from growing faint. As dusk approaches once more, he walks out across the lot for the last time that day. The Thunderbolt's shadow pools long and then thins. Lights click off one by one. He pauses at the fence and listens. For an instant he thinks he hears, beneath the distant traffic and the human murmur, the ghost of a propeller, a gentle, insistent buzzing like a memory insisting on being remembered. He does not reach out to touch the metal. He smiles instead, a small, private curve, and turns toward home with the sense that something has been arranged. Pieces placed in a line that might hold for as long as the living will tend them. Night comes down and the hangar doors close. He walks back beneath the maples, the path illuminated by a single street lamp. The world is not simpler for it. The same contradictions remain: pride and regret, craft and cost, but they are quieter. He has told his story again, and that telling has altered it subtly, made it more generous to the absent. The Thunderbolt keeps its echo, folded into skin and rivets, and the village of stories around it grows, patient as repair work, necessary as a logbook entry. He knows that he will return. He knows that the question about fear will be asked again, and that he will answer the same way, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the persistence of duty in company with it. The next morning will hold another small set of choices: to go back, to sit with the woman and her photograph, to answer the museum's recorder with the unvarnished truth. For now, he goes home, and the Thunderbolt does for the night what it has always done. It keeps a hollowed, metallic memory that will outlast him, a place for others to put their hands and measure what they must.